say my church did a good job of just laying a foundation, but not trying to put up walls to just keep you in. They left it where you can start exploring Christianity. And that's what I did. I learned about Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism. I learned about Methodism, Anglicanism, Lutheranism. I learned about a whole ton of traditions. And Eastern Orthodoxy kind of had really, really gripped me.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo, and this channel is a place where we do church history videos, Protestant apologetics, as I always say, insofar as Protestantism is an umbrella, like monotheism is an umbrella. And we like to explore the actual traditions that exist underneath that umbrella. And so not only do we like to explore those traditions, but we like to see how those traditions face up against the tradition of Roman Catholicism, the tradition of Eastern Orthodoxy, and so on and so forth, for the traditions that exist underneath what we've been calling in this corner of YouTube the ecclesialist umbrella, the umbrella that would have capital T infallible traditions outside of Scripture, that would rely upon oral tradition, that would have the sort of ecclesial structure that Eastern Orthodoxy, that Roman Catholicism, although Roman Catholicism is a little bit different because they have a centralized structure with the Pope as opposed to a decentralized situation there. But that being said, you know what I mean. I'll put out a different video, a different day, defining ecclesialism much more clearly. But with us today, we have a guest who is a Methodist, and who will be able to share with us his journey of becoming a Methodist, of what it was like facing up against Eastern Orthodoxy in his own personal walk. And so with us, we have my friend Joshua Pearsall, or Pearsall. I always forget how to pronounce your
Pearsall. Yeah, Pearsall. It's spelled like pear, but it's pronounced peer. Okay, I'm not sure where that happened.
I love how it took you a second to think about it too.
Yeah,
It's not just me. But my friend Josh and I met a while back when it's been like a year and a half, 2 years ago, at least when I joined SSBS, our Discord server.
It's been 1.5 to 2 years, I think, since SSBS started.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Since we first met, but then we became friends a little bit after that. And so for everyone that is curious at home, if you struggle with Eastern Orthodoxy, if you struggle with Roman Catholicism, as I always say, you can check in the description of every single one of my videos, and you'll see an invite to the Striving Side-by-Side server, SSBS as we call it, where Josh and I met, and where there's plenty of people that can help you deal with that stuff. But Josh, being with us today, you have a YouTube channel called Practical Christian Lessons. Before we jump into your testimony and our topic for today, why don't you tell everybody at home a little bit about your channel?
Yeah, right now it's focused on Wesleyan Arminianism, at least for the longer form videos. I go through shorts and stuff right now. We're just kind of going through Proverbs daily. And in the future, there are plans to do a bit more, but as we're kind of going through, I think there's a whole lot of Wesleyan Arminianism that really needs to go back to, right, sort of reform itself right now, as our ancestors did, and go back to our own sources and start refining our theology and returning to it and being like, hey, we've strayed and we need to go back to the Scriptures. We need to go back to what was set before us, and we really need to get buckled down on that. That's kind of the goal of the channel right now.
Seeing some of the more underrepresented Protestant traditions make it onto YouTube. I feel like Methodism is one that is, I know of maybe one other Methodist channel whose name escapes me right now, that you introduced me to before you started your channel. So there's not that many of them out there. So I'm always glad to see more people from these traditions, join YouTube. But with that, brother, what we're going to do here is, as per usual, like I do in these interviews, I will give you the floor so that you can share your story with us, because you weren't always a Methodist, about how you came to Christ, how you joined the Methodist Church, and then why you chose to remain a Methodist instead of swimming the Bosphorus, right? Is that what it is? Bosphorus, I think.
Yeah.
Over to the east. And so with that, I'm going to remove myself and just give you the floor.
Gotcha. Some people will know this, some people won't. I was raised in a non-denominational church, but I was never really that much of a believer myself. I was pretty skeptical of Christianity. I was one of those people that kind of looked at the Bible as sort of like a fairy tale. Is this really true? Did Jesus actually do these things? These things seem kind of crazy. And I never told anyone about it. I was raised in the church, and I was like, the last thing I'm going to do, I'm already kind of a weird kid. I'm not going to single myself out even more. And then eventually, right, not living a Christian life, not believing in it, I got mixed up with a pretty bad crowd when I was a kid. Drugs, alcohol, really rough party scene, and went through a dark time in my life as a child into my teens, and had this really nihilistic worldview. I thought my parents only loved me because I was their son, because it was a biological relation, that if I died, they'd be sad for a little bit, but it wouldn't be that sad. They'd move on. And if I thought about that, my family, you guys can just kind of take a few steps to imagine what I thought about the rest of the world. It was a really dark mindset to be in. Really just evil, and in hindsight is what I just call it, pure evil. And eventually kind of entered a depression, moved out of it. I met somebody who really helped me see that there was good in this world. And from there, having my nihilistic worldview shaken, I was like, well, what else have I been wrong about this entire time? And in hindsight, I can see God's grace working in the entire situation as I started to sort of piece together spiritual experiences in my life I couldn't explain. I started looking at historical evidence for the Bible. I looked at the flood narrative and the resurrection were the two things I looked at, and then the Exodus, 3 things total. And I started the resurrection, just kind of worked backwards, and I was like, well, first thing for Christianity, I know this much: prove the resurrection or don't prove it. That is what Christianity lies on. All right, I think there's enough evidence to support that. And I moved to Exodus because I was like, well, the people had to come from somewhere. If there seems to have been like these people that existed already and they're just making stuff up, that should be pretty easy to prove. And I became pretty easily convinced, even though we might not have exact details on the Exodus. This people just seem to arise out of nowhere and start knocking down major power structures in the ancient world. And that just doesn't make any sense on a logical perspective. And then the flood, you can have any number of debates on the flood, but the fact that so many ancient cultures had a flood narrative, I was just like, that can't be a coincidence. Whether or not I can parse out the details now, I was like a 13, 14-year-old kid. Like I said, I was a weird kid. That shows why this is where my brain went to when I was looking at Christianity. It just became so much, I couldn't ignore it. And then, I was baptized into my non-denominational church. I loved it. And I love that church. I would be happy to worship with them if I was still in that area. But a few years ago, I met my now wife, Patty, and she was a Methodist. And I kind of came over into the Methodist tradition mostly through her, because it was just her church. So when I moved over here, that's of course the first place I just started going. I was like, well, I need to kind of figure out where I am and just kind of plug myself in there. But sort of in the background of when we were dating before I got married and like leading up to when we were dating is when I first encountered Eastern Orthodoxy. And I learned about more than just the non-denominational world. I'd say my church did a good job of just laying a foundation, but not trying to put up walls to just keep you in. They left it where you can start exploring Christianity. And that's what I did. I learned about Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism. I learned about Methodism, Anglicanism, Lutheranism. I learned about a whole ton of traditions. And Eastern Orthodoxy kind of had really, really gripped me. Roman Catholicism, I just kind of moved past. But Eastern Orthodoxy, there was just something about it, and still to this day, that I just love. And I look at and appreciate so much in it. Even though I'm not it, I still have some objections. But when I had made my way into the Methodist church, where I'd gone, they just made it like a home. There was no big issues, and it's a big church. Some people would call our church a mega church. It's definitely the size. We've got a few thousand members. We are a big place. It didn't feel very big. It still didn't feel very big most days. Just the days it feels big is when you look out at the crowd. They got me plugged right in a wide array into community. They were really big about community, plugging in, getting to know people, being a disciple. And that's kind of one of those things that first really gripped me. And with Eastern Orthodoxy, a lot of the things that gripped me with them were a lot of the things that gripped me with Methodism. One of the things that kind of sits in my head a lot is Proverbs 25. I'll just read it out of this at the NASB. Um, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search out a matter. And that was one of the things that really, really gripped me about Eastern Orthodoxy is they had this huge view of mystery and the infallibility and endlessness of God that our fallible human mind just cannot fully grasp, no matter how long we have. He's infinite. We are finite. We can't reach that end. But they also had this huge, huge goal of just walking side by side with God and learning about this mystery and growing in God and growing closer to Him. And of course, in Methodism, we have a lot of those similar thoughts and teachings. Another thing I just loved about the Methodist Church is Arminian theology. I've never really been much for the Reformed tradition. I absolutely love them as brothers and sisters, but the Methodist theology, when I kind of got into it and started really digging into what John Wesley taught, what Charles Wesley, and then Jacob Arminius himself, older than that, what they kind of started teaching, I was like, this makes sense. This fits with how I viewed the Bible. This fits with what I've read. And that's kind of how I made my way into there. And then through a few years of looking at Eastern Orthodox claims, some kind, some not so kind, I just kind of eventually settled on Methodism. And Javier, if you want to come back in real fast, do you want me to sort of break the order here and just sort of go through everything I found alluring about Eastern Orthodoxy, or should we just like
skip something? I mean, that's perfect, because that was going to be, or as you know, that's the first question I had for you, and you went a little bit into it. So yeah, I mean, what are the other things that you found? Or yes, before you go into that, right? So you mentioned you found mystery alluring, which is interesting, because I want to go into that a little bit, because I think you hear a lot about Western mentalities, especially once you start dealing with Eastern Orthodox apologists and that side of the equation. And to some degree, I think that gets overplayed, right? Where almost anything you want to say gets played off as a Western idea sure. Sometimes, and people just don't want to deal with it. But there is also some degree of truth to that. And one of the things that I think seems a little bit different is the West seems a lot more focused on how many things can we answer, right, theologically? How many categories can we come up with? How can we fit everything into these little categories that we've created? And to some degree, I mean, I'm a big fan of systematic theology, right? So the theology nerd in me loves that. But there's, in the East, almost a different way of approaching that. And so why don't you, before you go into some of the other things, why don't you break that down a little bit more? Like, why is mystery appealing to you? And why do you think mystery is appealing to a lot of people that start looking into Eastern Orthodoxy, in contrast with the systematic, let's figure out as much as we can, Western mentality?
Yeah. I know for me, and of course I've been studying a lot of Wesleyan Arminian theology, especially as of late with the YouTube channel. I've been really delving in deep. I think the issue of predestination is like, not just saying that because I'm an Arminian and that's the quintessential debate with Reformed, but I feel like that's also just one of the quintessential like things that show that so well. The line of Arminius and John Wesley at the end of every predestination discussion, and even in the remonstrance and their 5 points that they sent to Dort, ended with, this is where the scripture ends. We need to leave it there. There's no point in trying to go further into this, to trying to figure it out, to trying to use reason or philosophy or anything else to go past what it said at this point. We know that God is sovereign. We know that God in some capacity has given us free will and the ability to make choices that matter, which Reformed wouldn't disagree with those things on those 2 points, at least classically. The disagreement then comes where we would say is they start trying to go past scripture and start asserting other things that we just don't see in the scriptures. And of course, Reformed will say, yes, we see these in the scriptures. It's not just us using reason and logic, but that's I think always going to be one of those arguments that just can't be settled. That's the highlight. That's the point. That's the tension between East and West. There is like, this is where we see the scriptures. This is where we see the scriptures and are coming to hear, yes, we're using our reason and our logic to get to these other things, but we also see it in the scriptures. And that's just where the argument's going to be, is like, we don't see it here. We do see it here, even if we're using these other tools to help us get there. And I'm not sure that barrier can ever be overcome. I think the best answer to that is always going to be agreeing to disagree. It doesn't have to be a divisive issue. And that goes the same with a ton of the East and West issues. Most of them, I think, can just be agree to disagree. Some of them are so big you can't, but maybe I'm just an ecumenical heretic. Who knows?
Bouncing off that, do you, in your own thinking, is leaving room for mystery? Does, I guess, in your thinking, does leaving room for mystery allow a greater sort of Catholicity or ecumenicity, I guess, if that's a word? Because I guess I can see, right, even though I'm a big fan of, well, these days, looking at Luther and stuff, I'm a little bit bigger fan of mystery. but normally, right, I understand, I see the allure behind, man, I want to figure this out. But to your point, maybe there is some degree to which when we figure this out, then we all end up at each other's throats to some degree. So, would you say that mystery then allows for greater camaraderie between Christians in your view?
I think naturally it does lend itself a bit better to it. I will say that, right, and I've had lots of fruitful discussions with Reformed, just as I have also had Reformed who've told me I'm not even a Protestant, just as I've also had conversations with Eastern Orthodox who say, yeah, you're part of the church, absolutely, and then those who say, no, you're not, you have to join us. So there's extremes on each end. I'd say mystery naturally will lend itself a bit more, because if you don't come to like this hard line, this is the only answer, then it leaves a lot more room for friendly dialogue and discussion on what it could be. But I think on the Reformed side, and in my experience, this has been the most fruitful ways people have discussed it, is if you will go to the scriptures and say, we can kind of see where you're coming from, even if we're disagreeing. And if you then go to the next step into like church fathers, if that's your cup of tea, it's definitely my cup of tea. And you say, we see both these views present in the fathers, or a variety of these views, or some kind of hybrid, like the early church had a lot of views. If we see it in possible in the scriptures, even if we disagree with the conclusion, if we see that the early church taught these things through whether it was just a couple centuries before it formalized itself in either a canon or a council and became one solid view, then maybe we can have room for those things to be allowed, even if we disagree. And I think both have room for Catholicity and for ecumenicalism, but I definitely think the mystery, leaving mystery at a lot of endpoints, does naturally lend to those discussions being easier to have.
Yeah. I would also wonder too, for yourself and for other people that find a lot of alluring features in Eastern Orthodoxy, if mystery, not just leaving things up to mystery, but also the fact that there is no Eastern Orthodox catechism, right? As much as sometimes we, and I think rightfully so, critique our Roman Catholic friends for their arguments where they say, hey, we can infallibly define things, but they don't give us infallible lists of infallible things. Right? As much as we critique them, would you say that it's alluring maybe for people and for yourself even at that time to look at a communion where they don't have a catechism? They may have councils that they adhere to, but they don't have any systematic, like, here's how all of us approach this, right? Where it's really decentralized is what Eastern Orthodoxy is. Would you say that there's an element of that which is alluring?
Yeah, at least for me, definitely. I know some people love the high structure in Roman Catholicism, right? You have the magisterium that will give you the answers in these formalized ways in these documents. I get the appeal of that. For me, I'm kind of on the other end. It's just like, I don't need to have a formalized list. If I have someone I can just go talk to, and that will help me work through these things, give me the answer. Even if there's not a formalized process for it, that's good enough. We don't have to have answers to everything. And that helped my spiritual journey a lot in my Eastern Orthodox and Protestant and Roman Catholic kind of sorting through all that, was when I accepted I don't have to know everything. And maybe that's also another reason Eastern Orthodoxy shined a bit brighter than Roman Catholicism for me. It was just like, yeah, that's an acceptable answer, right? You don't know, you don't have to know. You can come talk to your priest, listen to them. They'll give you answers. If our council has declared it, then you have your answer already. And if not, yeah, there's tons of room for mystery in their tradition.
And I think, again, for those of us that are steeped in a kind of theological world where, like I said, right, everything has its own gazillion subcategories, and everyone's debating with each other. And obviously, that still happens in Eastern Orthodoxy, as I'm sure we can touch on a little bit later once you get past the surface. But in a world where you have all that going on, I think it does make sense that you look across the yard and you see the grass looking a little bit greener on the other side when it comes to those things, and not having to have absolutely everything figured out, not a stance on everything, not a stance. And I can see how that would be alluring. And so that's mystery then for one of the things that you found alluring. What else did you find alluring about Eastern Orthodoxy?
Salvation would kind of never portrayed as a single moment. I don't blame my old church. I don't remember them specifically teaching this, but there is absolutely a large part of the low church, non-denom, evangelical, whatever you want to call them, part of the Protestant movement that definitely sort of like portrays you were saved at this moment. You have been saved at that moment. You're always saved now. Or maybe there's some other variations, but like they always portrayed it as a moment. And I was like, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't seem to fit with what Scripture has told me. It's not like I was saved. It's like I am saved and I'm going to be saved. It's always felt like this ongoing thing. And of course, in Eastern Orthodoxy, if anyone's dug in there a lot, you hear about theosis. That is absolutely is how they viewed it. The aesthetics, I'm going to have to try carefully to pronounce this correctly. Ascetics and aesthetics, and then the tradition. There is a huge focus on holiness and godly living. Not that Protestants don't teach the value of works, but I have seen a lot in the defense of sola fide. It's almost like works just get thrown out, right? The baby with the bathwater. It just gets pushed down so far that in some cases I've just seen churches that just never talk about it. And I'm just like, that's too far in the other direction. And absolutely, there's the beauty of smells and bells, which, of course, you hear tons of people say is not a reason to convert in and of itself, but that doesn't make it any less appealing. It's still beautiful. And as I said, the assurance of an infallible teaching source to help fight disunity is something that was appealing to me. Yes, they leave a lot of room for mystery, and you will find a ton of variety in Eastern Orthodoxy. It's not quite as unified as some would tell you, but on the things that the councils have declared, that there are clear writings on a variety of their fathers that they have determined as the tradition that's been passed down, then they'll generally stick to that. It is nice to just be like, yeah, this is the clear-cut answer in this particular instance, which can be a bit harder to find in Protestants. Not that we don't have that, right? Every tradition has confessions. Every tradition has its own creeds, and they'll kind of try to stick to. But again, having grown up in the non-denominational world, that wasn't really there. And I think that's a good thing to have, right? You need to have room to say everyone's a Christian who is a Christian. You need to have room for theological diversity where it's allowed. But there is, I think, there is a place for creeds even in the non-denominational world that maybe has a time to come back.
Well, let me ask a couple questions then with a few of those, because this is fascinating. Ever since I did my interview with Dr. Chris Castaldo, right, with his book on that he wrote with Dr. Brad Littlejohn on this issue, I start to see so many points of connection between all of our stories, right? For those of us that struggled with this stuff, for those of us that had questions, and even several of the things you've described here, right? Aesthetics, beauty, tradition, right? Ascetics, I pronounce those as well. Both of those. There is this sort of grounding that I think, at least that's sold to people, right? Where people look, and certainly they tend to be over at Eastern Orthodoxy, in general, much more historically grounded than your regular non-denom or Baptist or Pentecostal. Sometimes maybe even lower church Presbyterian sort of churches. And so I think when a lot of people look over there, right, in an age where we don't see grounding for ourselves in a lot of things, in an age where everyone likes to say that truth is subjective, when gender is fluid and all these different things are changing and nothing seems solid, at least the way that the culture tries to sell it. People look over, I think, at Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, but I feel like especially with Eastern Orthodoxy, and there's sort of like a trance that people get into, because they're like, wow, I guess I said it about Rome as well, but it's like, wow, the East looks like this bulwark against modernity, because everything there looks ancient, everything looks old, from the vestments to the icons on the wall, to the practices, to everything. Just nothing fits our current day. And I would wonder from your perspective if you would agree, right? That man, there's a sense in which we want to be grounded. We don't see that in the culture around us. Maybe we don't even see that in our own church, and so we start being kind of pulled in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. When I was just kind of in the non-denominational world and hadn't been exposed to any of this stuff, right? And I'll say my non-denominational church was very Orthodox. Even today, maybe they don't give the Eucharist as much as I would like, but in terms of human sexuality, in terms of culture, in terms of what the Bible teaches, they were very Orthodox, and I'm happy to call them brothers and sisters. But when I got hit with the Eastern Orthodox initial brunt, it was just like, well, there's these much older, much more firm things I've just never heard about, and that seem to stand a lot stronger and have much firmer legs against a lot of the cultural attacks on Christianity. And that had a huge appeal for me. Not that I, was thinking that anyone else wasn't a Christian. It took a bit before I heard the one true church claim. That wasn't the first thing I ran into, luckily. But it was just like, there has to be something that can handle the constant cultural barrage that started happening on Christianity, even here down here in the Bible Belt. I live in one of the most conservative states. I think we are the most conservative state now down here in Oklahoma, and I can just see even here the attacks on Christianity starting to take hold in a lot of places and start wiping away things. And I'm just like, I want to be able to show up to my church in 50 years and be there with my grandkids. I want to be able to know my great grandkids are going to be able to go to the same place I was at if they want to, and be able to worship there. And I didn't feel super confident that I was going to get that in non-denominationalism. In the Christianity I had grown up in, I wasn't confident it would withstand that time.
Yeah, and I think it's a sentiment that a lot of people share, right? And again, when they start looking over to the other side, even just from an initial sort of first impression, it's like, well, it feels ancient, it looks ancient, and ancient insofar as we are concerned, absolutely.
Yep.
But there's also, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later when we get to some of your critiques, is there's also an assumption though that is then made that just because something looks ancient in comparison to us, that therefore it's apostolic.
Yep.
Right, that therefore it must go all the way back. It looks so old. It's older than me. So it must go all the way back to the apostles. That's what they're claiming anyway. And there's almost an assumption that happens. It's not a healthy assumption, and in a lot of cases ends up being incorrect. Right, but we'll talk more about that later. So that was some of the aesthetics, the beauty, the tradition. Something I forgot to mention with the beauty also is, for a lot of us, right, as much as this can come off superficial to some degree, when people look around the service that they're a part of every Sunday morning, they look at their church building, they look at the practices, things don't look beautiful, right? But when they look over to the east, it's like, wow, you have all this ornate stuff, you have these paintings, you have, like, they're using incense, they're using these things. And it's fascinating for me because when I talk with my dad, who grew up in South America, surrounded by Roman Catholic stuff all the time, and my mom, who grew up as a Roman Catholic, for them that stuff doesn't mean anything, and they actually almost actively dislike it, which I think is taking it a little bit too far. But for them, it's like that doesn't mean anything to them. They're like, oh, what's authentic to us is just the faith and fellowship with other believers and the scriptures, and that's it. And they like things very stripped down. But for a lot of people, it's the opposite, right? And I feel like for a lot of people, the opposite, whereas my parents grew up around that stuff all the time, and they know a lot of the issues with the doctrine. They assimilate those two, or rather, they bring those two things together in their mind. They assimilate them together. For a lot of people nowadays, I think it's the opposite, right? I think it's they grew up around not highly decorated churches. They grew up around places that are devoid of religious art. They grew up around places that don't feel transcendent. And so that is the very thing that they desire. And that's what means a lot to them. And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing that with our generation as well. And again, that goes hand in hand, I think, with a lot of this. Wow, they look like this traditional bulwark. But was that a big thing for you? Like the paintings, how ornate things are, how beautiful and transcendent they feel. Did that play a factor for you?
It was definitely part of my initial attraction. It didn't sway me much, as maybe in my conversion story showed, I'm a very literally minded, analytical individual. As much as I like smells and bells, I also recognize there's a lot of beauty in a lot of things, not all of it good for you. So I knew that just beauty, as much as I wanted, and I still wanted in my, if I could have an Eastern Orthodox style liturgy in my church right now, I would be very happy. I'm probably one of the only people in my church who would want that. But I knew pretty quick. I was like, all right, I can't just be enamored by the smells and bells. I have to actually look at what's being taught here and evaluate it on that.
Yeah. And so to comment then on a couple of the other things that you said, right? So you mentioned, um, again, this assurance of an infallible teaching. For those that follow my channel, I know this is a horse that, you're like, man, the horse is dead. Like, like stop feeding it. But we kind of have to because it's
Yeah.
something that comes up just so often. Was that also then another? You said that was kind of a source of allurement for you.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk a little bit more about that, right? So, what is so alluring about this infallible teaching source that our Eastern Orthodox friends tout?
For me, and I think part of this comes from being such an analytical person. Of course, now I take a lot of joy in searching scripture. Not that I didn't when I was younger, but it definitely felt a lot more daunting and tiring when I was younger. It's just like there's so much to go through. There's so much to try and understand. I wish someone could just kind of spoon feed me the answer, so I don't have to do this hard work.
Yeah.
And now, of course, I take joy in the work and reading commentaries and going through all that. But even just a few years ago, when I started looking at all the different traditions, I was just like, the idea of someone being able to tell me the things I can't figure out sounds so good. Because there are things, and before I accepted that I just can't know everything. And I think part of that absolutely stems from I'm a prideful person. It's one of my natural problems. I tend to always fall more towards pride and have to fight to keep myself humble. And struggling to think I can't know everything was a big problem for me. It's just like having someone who is there to give me the answers that one day I might even be able to be part of. That sounded really appealing. And that kind of was an appeal for me until I got knocked out from under it. But
Well, yeah, well, it is for a lot of people, right? Because it's what you're saying. It's wow. And again, please, no one at home, Eastern Orthodox friends, don't mishear us. We're not saying this in a pejorative sense, but in a very real sense, it is very appealing to think, wow, I don't have to sit down here with all these ancient tomes and these 66 books, or I guess more, if you're Eastern Orthodox, of the scriptures. I don't have to sit down with all this stuff and rack my brain and try to figure it out, right? And there's something appealing to that because as human beings, it's something that I say all the time. As human beings, our brains like shortcuts, right? You see this all the time during, for example, we have, I guess, an election cycle coming up. You see it all the time with elections, right? All it takes is, oh, this politician did one thing I didn't like, or they wore a piece of clothing that I thought was tacky, or I saw this one bad headline. That's it. That's all I need to know. That's why I'm voting at the polls, right?
Yeah.
And that's because we have so many things going on. We have our families, we have our friendships, we have our jobs. We have then on top of that scripture to figure out and how to live our life in accordance with it. And it's very appealing, I think, for all of us to say, okay, not only do I have to do all that stuff, but then I might do all that stuff and be wrong. What if I can just give my not even just power, responsibility of interpretation over to someone else, and they're infallible? That's even better.
Yeah.
And so, on the one hand, it's very appealing for that reason. But on the other hand, once you realize that we can't do theology based off what we would like to be true or what would be nice if it was true,
Yep.
and we start demanding like what is actually the evidence underlying this, is when the story comes up a little bit short, in my opinion. I don't know if you would agree with that.
No, I completely agree. Thinking about it, I do think it's also important to add this is not a knock on tradition in general. And Javier's the same way, and a lot of Protestants you meet will be the same way. Absolutely stick with the historic teachings of the church. Don't be innovators. Innovation, this is one of the few times innovation is really bad. Don't be an innovator. But like I tell a lot of the times I teach classes, if I tell you something you've never heard, if you can't go find it in the book, don't trust me. Just call me a heretic.
Yeah, don't buy it. All right, I agree. Well, and before you give your answer, I want to commend that as well. Yeah, when we talk about tradition, obviously we're referring to lowercase t tradition, right, which is fallible. and can be reformed. But we want to find our ideas in the ancient church. We want to find, at the very least, right, the the core ideas, things that are fundamental to our faith. We want to find those in not just in the scriptures, although that's the main place, but secondarily in the history of the church. We want to be able to keep the faith with the rest of the church. Although, as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, that's not as simple as saying, the same way that it's not as simple to say just, well, it would be nice to have an infallible interpreter, so therefore an infallible interpreter must exist. Similarly, just because it would be nice to say, oh, the church always had this consensus about everything, I'm just going to join the consensus,
Yeah.
just because that would be nice doesn't make it true either. And so, what are some of your thoughts with that? I mean, when it comes to, it would be nice to have these things, but a lot of the time people get fooled by what would be nice to have, and therefore
Yeah.
assume therefore this thing must exist.
Yeah. Again, this I think is one of those situations. My very literal mind's a benefit to me in a lot of these cases, where I was kind of forced to things like things I would like to be true. There are a lot of things about the secular world I would just love if I could take their word for it and believe it's right. I don't want to have fights with my friends. I don't want to have lost friends over some of these issues. I don't want there to be all this division over these things. But at the end of the day, and what I've seen in every Christian tradition, yeah, we have answers, and a lot of times we have right answers, but we still have to look at them and evaluate those claims. There's no escaping the fact that we have to interpret and use private judgment. And I know Rivers talked about that a lot. I know that's been a big talking point on this channel, but you just can't. As much as it would be nice to just have the answers, there's going to be things that in the moment you have to look at it and just be like, all right, I have to decide now, and I have to decide on what I know and what's been told to me and what I've read and what's been the handed down things that have been true time and time again.
Yeah, and like I always say as well, if it didn't work for Adam, in the garden to go up to the Lord and say, Lord, the woman that you gave me
Yeah.
fed me this fruit. Similarly, it's not going to work to go up on Judgment Day and say, well, Lord, the interpreter that you gave me told me to do X, Y, or Z. Because at the end of the day, even if we are giving up our right of interpretation, we're responsible for the giving up of that right of interpretation.
Yep.
And if it just so happens that the magisterium or the individuals that we're giving our interpretation to are not infallible and end up misusing that, that ultimately goes back on us. And we end up being responsible for that. But maybe we can develop that a little bit more later as well. I know I keep saying that, but to finish getting through then some of the things you found appealing. I know you've had good interactions with Eastern Orthodox people offline, believe it or not. Some of our people that only know our Eastern Orthodox friends that are online, the Ortho Bros online. And so why don't you talk a little bit about that as an appealing point for Orthodoxy?
Yeah. One of the things I encountered long before I met someone like Craig Trugel on the internet, I met as in encountered his content, was just sitting down. Not a ton, right? A lot of this searching was done during COVID, so there's only so much interaction we were allowed down here at that time. But finding people who were actually priests, who were deacons, who were actually attending Orthodox churches and services, people who'd grown up in Orthodox churches and hearing about what it was that they were taught and how they understood things. It was very different when I encountered the online Orthodoxy. Yes, there was still some overlap, right? We have the apostolic succession, we have the teachings of the apostles, we are the preserved church. That was all still there. There wasn't nearly as much exclusivity, right? I was met with, yeah, you're a Christian, and we would love it if you had the fullness of the faith with us. We think you still have the faith, but you're missing some of the fullness that you get here in Eastern Orthodoxy. It was very welcoming, arms wide open. I never felt like I was being forced in anything. I never felt like my beliefs were being like attacked as a challenge. I did understand they didn't agree with me, but it wasn't like my entire belief system was just being undermined. It was just conversation and dialogue in a positive case for Eastern Orthodoxy. And what feels like, especially now, I've just grown to dislike polemics. And that's just what is really common among the apologists, is like attacks on other traditions, and not always accurate ones, not always good ones. But that openness and that welcomeness, just being willing to talk, was very welcoming.
Well, and you see that, to your point, online a lot, right? I just
Yeah.
put out a video recent. Well, I'm saying recently, but this video will probably be several weeks later. But I put out a video not that long ago, dealing with even some claims that were just immediately launched at some of the stuff that uh, James White said in my interview with him, and it
Yeah.
ended up being, unfortunately, so rabid, incredibly insulting claims and comments that were being made based on a complete misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Just based a 2 hour live stream on a 4 minute section of our video based on a misunderstanding of what James White had said. This is the kind of stuff you only get on the internet.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, I think it's only fitting to close out this first section of what was alluring. A lot of people who only know Eastern Orthodox people on the internet may have this thought in their mind of like, well, everyone's just this rabid ortho bro, scream at you until you're going to hell and and say
No.
horrendous things to you and about you and about your family. But that's just not the case, right? Every person that I know, I myself have not gone to any Eastern Orthodox liturgy or service, but all the people that I do know in real life that have gone, they find everybody incredibly welcoming. Every once in a while, there's a little bit of a rub if you're not a part of, if you don't fit like the culture that is represented, right, or the ethnicity that is represented. But most of the time, even in spite of that, people tend to be very friendly, and that's something that people don't see online, but it can actually be a point of allure for people. With that though, so then I want to move then from that. Those are some of the things that you found alluring, some of the things that were kind of bringing you in that direction. Which of the East claims most troubled you at the beginning of your search? And then how did you go about evaluating the merit of those claims in such a way that you ended up, well, not Eastern Orthodox?
Yeah. I know we've talked. I'm going to beat the horse again to emphasize that a lot of the differences, the things that gave me trouble, were not talking with people who were actually in parishes, who were actually serving ministry. It was a lot with the online community. Is that we are the one true church, the only church. There is no salvation outside of us. And that we teach exactly what the church taught and have no errors. That was the part that really kind of struck a chord with me when it was put into that exact phrasing, is that there have been no changes and no errors. Now, unlike a lot of people, this didn't really cause me to like have a ton of anxiety. I know you've had a lot of people on here, and we have a ton of people in SSBS who, my heart goes out to them. The amount of anxiety people can have over this hurts a lot. And no matter where you are in your church right now, that's one thing I don't want you to have, is this anxiety. And that's sort of my advice to everyone as I was going through this research myself, is I asked myself, what is the character of God? Does he want to damn me? And the answer is no. God wants everyone to be saved. He wants everyone to repent, to come to him, to accept him as Lord and Savior. And he extends the olive branches. He reaches out, right? So right now, if he, in this case was the question I asked, if I am truly pursuing God, if you are truly pursuing God, would this not like be the idea of baptism of desire, which I think a lot of us have heard right now, especially if you're already in a Christian church? Surely then, as I asked myself the hard question, and this was kind of a switching point for me, and I think this is what prevented me from going into anxiety. For some people, this would be the very thing that causes them to have anxiety. I asked myself, if I am damned right now, if I knew for certain I was going to go to hell, would I still seek to strive and serve and follow God? And for me, that answer was yes. Even if I knew I was going to hell, would I do it as well as I could? No. I think if you knew you were on a one-way track to hell, you definitely wouldn't be putting in your best foot. But for me, it was God is the righteous judge, the perfect judge. Whatever fate I get was the fate I deserved. And he's also a loving God and a merciful God and a gracious God who keeps his promises and is true to his word. So I knew I could trust him no matter where it was. And that was, I'm not going to cry, I promise. The big switching point for me in the search is like, I really need to slow down and evaluate some things. And I went through a lot of claims. The Roman Catholics I dismissed pretty quickly. It just seems so ahistorical. I get some of the things that draw people in, but like the papacy was almost like an immediate, no, you're gone. The papacy was just so ridiculous. But when I encountered figures like Craig Trugala, who used the fathers, they did seem to line up and point to those ancient traditions. And I also knew I had to start digging a little deeper than just listening to a random apologist online. I know how misleading quotes can be sometimes. I had to actually dig into the quotes they were using. I had to do the due diligence and listen to the Protestant side as well and look at the Reformation and what they said. Because I was just like, well, people aren't dumb, and there's nothing new under the sun. These can't be things that no one told anyone for the past 500 years. So I started checking the quotes. I was reading the context they were in. It was the first thing was checking quotes from the Eastern Orthodox apologists. And I just found out that some of them weren't right. Some of them were taken out of context, or they just seemed to not be using it the way that the initial author intended. And I fancy myself an amateur historian. I also looked at the historical evidence as what happened to and with the church. And what I found didn't match the story that was really being told, that there weren't changes, that there weren't developments, that it was the one church from the beginning. And I started finding a lot of holes in the anti-Protestant claims that kind of at first gave me some pause and was like, am I in a dangerous place here? Luckily, I did award looking at the Protestant traditions first. I was like, well, non-denominational hasn't always been the answer. There's other church traditions. I should look at those. And I found that a lot of the critiques really only hit the Protestant, like low church evangelical, like the very tradition I'd grown up in and that I was familiar with. But when I started looking at the more historic churches, they didn't really seem to hit very hard. It's like they're not even talking about Lutheranism. They're not even talking about Anglicanism. They're not talking about these high church movements, and only sort of like poking holes. Not that, critiques don't come out from time to time, but it was really strange that almost all of them were focused on this one part of the Protestant movement. It gave me a huge pause there. And then digging even further into that, right? No Protestants have confessional practices. No Protestants affirm Christ's presence in the Eucharist, or that it's a means of grace, right? All the usual really terrible pop level apologetics that I'm sure a ton of us have been exposed to, and many more will be exposed to after us.
And if I can get in there as well, one of the things that I find very ironic about that is that as effective as it is, unfortunately so, at getting people that just, again, they not that they didn't know any better, but almost like they didn't know any better, right? They didn't know anything about church history. They don't know who the church fathers are. They don't know. And I think all the stuff that you're saying, right? Hey, all Protestants out there, right? They're not confessional. They don't believe in the ecumenical councils at all. They don't affirm Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper. It's just a symbol for a lot of people, unfortunately, right? Whereas for you were like, wait a minute, let me actually, like you said, right? Let's be analytical about this. Let's try to dig a little bit further. Let's see if any of this is actually true. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, they hear that and it matches their own personal context, and they just assume all of Protestantism, right? Whatever that is, all of Protestantism must be the same way, and they make the mistake of aligning their particular tradition with the entire umbrella. And they think that one tradition must be the exact same as every other tradition under this umbrella. And unfortunately, it's very effective. But to your point, it sounds like in your story, it's a double-edged sword, because it's very effective insofar as the person doesn't actually double check the things that are being said. But when they actually dig deeper and they say, well, what is the Reformation about? And they start learning about the Reformation, they start reading some of the reformers, they start looking around, or maybe they have friends in other more liturgical, more historically rooted, theologically rich traditions. And suddenly it's like, wait a minute, I'm being either misrepresented or just straight up being lied to by the opposition. And it can generate, I think, rightfully so, distrust of the other side when they do it. So it really almost is like a shooting of themselves in the foot.
But, for sure.
And so with that as well, something else I wanted to comment on here, I guess, is when it comes to actually double checking these things, right? Because like you said, for same thing, a lot of people don't know who the church fathers are. It's easy to hear a church father and, but they said this, and sometimes it's like, it's a whole paragraph long, the quotation. It's over.
Yeah.
Right? It's we must go to the east, or I must submit to the Pope or whoever we're talking to on the ecclesialist side. Um, but a lot of people just don't think to sit down and just Google the quote a lot of the time, right?
Yeah.
I think you tell me from your experience, right? From my experience, it's been two things. One, actually looking up the quote and reading, like, what is even going, what is this work about? What is even
Yeah.
happening here? A lot of the time is enough to dispel a quote that is being used incorrectly. Um, but sometimes reading the quote, it's like, oh, maybe it is saying something similar to what they're saying, but it's not actually wholesale the concept they're trying to sell me on.
Yeah.
It's just vaguely similar. What has been your experience doing that? Like actually double checking these claims, and how do you go about it? How do you suggest people go about it?
If you're fortunate, they will give you the exact spot to find the citation, which would be nice. And luckily, most of the works where people quote from, you can find it on CCEL. It's Christian Classics, a thorough library. Was a staple for me and still is today to do research on that kind of stuff. Maybe this is part of my historian tendencies, but is also going to like church history books, which of course can be hard to get, especially if they're newer or very limited printing. But there are free ones out there. There are some podcasts, some YouTube channels. Some people, if you can sift through it all, you can find the genuinely good stuff. The things to look for are always, are they using primary sources, and are they giving you the proper citation that you can go check and prove it's true? If someone quotes Eusebius's church history, which is one of the first places I went to look when evaluating a lot of these claims, it was still is one of the big church history books used in every early church look at. If someone's quoting from there and it's lining up, that's a good start. If they're quoting from like 500 years later, I tend to dismiss them pretty quickly and move on to someone who's going to the older sources. Outside of, yes, of course, check the original work. If you can also find contemporaries of that same time period, if they're commenting and it seems to match up with what you're finding in these other things, that's also a big indicator. Okay, this might be on the right track. Because a lot of the times, as you said, they might say something similar, but then when you go look into what it is they're addressing in that time and other teachings of the church at the time, it's like they've got it slightly off or they're slightly wrong. And that can be, though I don't think it's often the case, it can be intentional. I think a lot of it can just be, right, this is one of my critiques of Craig Trugula. He has this huge presupposition on how to read the church fathers, which is that you must harmonize them. There cannot be any errors between them. That will absolutely skew how you read church fathers. Whereas if you go read other people and look at the things they were addressing, it changes the way you read those things. And you don't have to harmonize them. There's no need to. Church fathers said different things and had different opinions. But it makes a huge difference when you go back and evaluate these claims. It's like, all right, this was the specific issue they were addressing. This was the specific battle they were fighting and the specific people they were speaking to. And if they, say with Augustine is one of the classic go-tos, because one, he changed his mind over time, but two, you see him talk differently to different groups is one of the like go-to examples to see that in, especially if people are quoting him in some of these apologetics, is like, go see the different ways he talked to in different debates into different churches. He spoke differently to him, and then we got to take that into account.
And church fathers sometimes, again, they're just like people. Like you said, I guess I always got brought up because, well, he did us the favor of writing an entire book, either doubling down on things that he said previously or correcting himself on things that he had changed his mind, right? Retractions. And he writes his book. But the church fathers, sometimes they change their minds as they get older and better read and speak with different people. Sometimes they just disagree with one another. So another thing that helped me as well, that I'm sure probably helped you, is realizing as Protestants, when we're arguing against things that we believe to be accretions don't just pop in out of nowhere at the Reformation.
Yeah.
All right, like accretions, they're built up through this very slow process. If someone has an idea, or someone misinterprets something, or someone is told something, and they find it to be true, they start spreading it to others, convincing others. Sometimes you have different versions of that same idea, similar things, slightly different, and that starts building up and up and up and up and up until suddenly you end up with a ton of people, maybe even a majority of them, believing this thing. And it may not have started at the Reformation. Maybe it starts in the Middle Ages. Maybe it starts in the age of the Church Fathers. Who knows? But in either case, if we're going to believe in the existence of theological accretions, these things that built up over time, they're not a part of the original deposit of faith, right? The faith once for all delivered to the saints. If we're going to believe in that, then we shouldn't be surprised when we see a church father, or we see someone in the Middle Ages, or we see someone at some point saying vaguely similar things to the fully developed accretion, because that's one of the things that blows my mind sometimes. Is sometimes people will say like, "Oh yeah," and I'll run into people whom I love, Protestants whom I love, who are like, "Man, yeah, of course, I believe in accretions," but then it bothers them that a church father said something that is vaguely similar that sounds vaguely similar to purgatory, sounds vaguely similar to something else later. It's like, well, this was bound to happen. These are accretions. They come from somewhere, right? Someone at some point had to start this. Someone at some point had to believe this, and it shouldn't bother us if we say, "Hey, I believe this is an accretion." I can make a really good case for it, just because someone believes something slightly similar, right? And the one that comes to my mind, because I've been thinking about it recently, is part of this bait and switch that happens, that is presented by some apologists on the Roman Catholic side. Is they'll say, "Oh well, don't you know that everyone believed in purgatory? Here's a bunch of examples of people praying for the dead." And when you actually weigh through the example is 90% of them are a friend who was a Christian, or a family member who was a Christian died, and they're like, "Lord, please give this person the fullness of your joy. Lord, please comfort this person." And they're like, "Oh, there it is. It's purgatory." what? What are we talking about? This is like it's big, or they'll find examples of, "Oh Lord, like lower the suffering of this individual who they believe to be a pagan, or someone that faith." Like, "Oh, purgatory." And it's like, okay, just because these two ideas involve praying, involve dead people,
Yep.
that doesn't mean purgatory. Right? And we can't pretend that it does. It's not helpful to pretend that it means purgatory, that it means toll houses, or that it means anything of the sort. And so I just wanted to go over that a little bit, right, for people at home who are maybe struggling with this stuff. Like, man, the Protestant impulse of ad fontes, back to the sources,
Yep.
actually, like you're saying, reading the fathers themselves, reading ancient histories, and reading modern day histories that are synthesizing the information of a bunch of ancient histories and sources. But with that, sorry,
Yeah, you're
to
good.
let
You're
you
good.
go ahead and continue. So one of the things you said that bothered you and that troubled you, which troubles everybody, right? This idea of, hey, we're the one true church, we're the ark, and the flood is coming, and you're standing outside of the ark. And so why don't you maybe comment on that a little bit more?
Yep, for sure. And I actually think I can tie both those things together. One thing you will see a lot in the church fathers is a huge value on church authority, which is a good thing, and in some cases, elevating it really highly. And you'll also see that claim used to support the no salvation outside of our little one institution. Well, I know it'll come down in the interview later, but we also get then a ton of church fathers who absolutely challenged church authority and took big issues with things that came in, and are now heroes of the faith for fighting the church on those matters. Whereas if they had yielded, they would not have been good. We could all be Arians right now. It'd be bad. But on
bet the knee.
Yeah,
Then things would not have worked.
Yeah, but that's a huge knock in the whole "it's one institution," which was one of those things that when I first heard it was one of the things that I was like, that doesn't fit at all with Scripture. And then when I started looking into the history, didn't fit at all there. The Arian controversy was perhaps one of the biggest things that shook my world with Eastern Orthodoxy, is the entire thing. But even then, when I looked at scriptures, you'll know them by their fruit. I look at the Baptist church down the road and I see fruit. I look at the Eastern Orthodox I had so many good conversations with. I see fruit. Good fruits, spiritual fruits, not just fruits of good works, fruits of joy, of happiness, of love, of peace. The fruits that are promised to us, God's promises. God is faithful to keep his promises. I can't just ignore that these fruits are being here. And thinking to the examples, when the apostles find the demonics, or the exorcist on the road, and told them to stop because you're not of us. And Jesus was like, "What are you doing, you idiots? let them cast out the demons. They're not against us. They're of us." I'm just like, that. We can't just ignore those. So that was one of the huge things. And once again, that was one of those things where there just was disharmony with what I'd encountered in on the ground Orthodox Christians. Is that was not a thing they had. And I was like, where are these apologists getting it from? And it is from actual teachings of the church, from things people have taken. And I would argue, and I know quite a few Orthodox who would agree with me, is it started way back with like Cyril, and then over time became this much harsher thing where now it is the official stance, I'd argue, of Orthodoxy, right? You read the Second Council of Nicaea, I'm in a bad situation according to that council. And to quite a few of the other councils, and it has become this sort of exclusivist thing written in the canons. And though a lot of people don't see it on the ground, and I agree with them, I think they're in the right spot. I can't just square that with the official teachings of the church. Even if you take away we're the only church, you still have to sign on to all these anathemas in the councils. You still have to sign all these things that, even if you're not saying we're the only institution, the amount of anathemas you put on there might as well be saying the same thing. And I just can't sign on with that. It just doesn't fit. I can't see it. It's just not there.
Especially, I would say, when those anathemas are tied to things like in Nicaea too, right? To bad biblical argumentation, supporting this theology of veneration of icons as windows into heaven, right? When we see this bad biblical argumentation, when we hear claims about this has been the practice of the fathers, right? And it's a practice that's been handed down from the apostles to the fathers, to the fathers, to the fathers, down to us. And then when you look at the historical record, that doesn't seem to be the case, right? When you're tying anathemas to that, or it's not even like an anathema being given, and which would be rightfully so, to someone who denies the deity of Christ, or someone who denies the Trinity, or someone who falls into one of the gazillion crazy heresies. This is just like Nicaea too. It's anathematizing people who do not want to bow down to, show reverence to, and kiss icons. You're told to not, if I remember correctly, I believe there's an anathema, or not an anathema, there's a condemnation of people who know iconoclasts and who continue being their friends, continue associating with them.
Let me see if I can. I have that quote. I'm going to see if I can find it. I know I can. But no, you're right. And that's one of the things that gave me huge pause with the anathemas, was this sort of like retroaction applying anathemas. And you'll hear people who say they don't apply to people of the past, but then I'm like, that has to imply it is not a teaching of the church in the past if you're not anathematizing those in the past. As I try to find this, one of the go-to examples for me is Origen and Didymus the Blind. A lot of people might know Origen, they might not know Didymus the Blind. He was, for most accounts and purposes, a church father in Africa, who were condemned well after their deaths. I think both of them over 100 years. I think it was one of the Chalcedonian councils, and they were condemned. The exact wording is the teachings of them are condemned. So some people will argue that they're not condemned, just their teachings. I'm like, well, then how are you distinguishing between the heretical teaching and the teacher? That seems really strange. But even then, they were both considered Orthodox champions of the faith in their lifetime. The positive impact Origen had on the church that we still feel to this day is so immense. You're going to call this man heretic? Like, when he was... Not that everything Origen taught was right. I'm not saying that. Don't say that I said that. Anyone, please. But it's just this thing of like, we're going to change so drastically from calling this man an Orthodox hero of the faith to a condemned teacher. Like, that makes no sense.
That's one of the funny things for me, where a lot of the time you'll see Eastern Orthodox people online who will, for example, take aim at Calvinists, and like one of the things they always take aim at is like, oh, you Calvinists with this whole like someone apostatizes, they were never saved to begin with. And it's kind of funny for me because I'm like, well, but the way that you deal with some of these men in history, it's like, oh, they're a champion of the faith, until suddenly a decree, a canon of a council telling the traditions like, actually, they were never champions of the faith to begin with. Right? It's like they were never solid Christians to begin with. And it really feels like real life retconning, right, of the past and what is going on with the past. Absolutely.
Yep. I have found where I wrote the citation. It's page 529 of the 7 ecumenical councils. I just have to try and read through this on here, but it does say in here, associating with iconoclast is no bueno. No iconoclast associations. switch it to the PDF view. Feel free to move on to the next question while I do this. This might take a minute with my old man eyes.
So you said you take an issue with the anathemas, right? Especially like we said with Nicaea 2 anathematizing something that doesn't seem to be anathema for the better part of 8 centuries. Right? And so how do you view development? Because sometimes I feel like you have some Eastern Orthodox that say, yeah, some degree of development is fine. You have others, right, that will say, hey, even through the Roman Catholic friends who are trying to defend Nicaea 2, especially we saw, for example, in the wake of Gavin Ortland's video from Truth Unites on Nicaea 2, we saw a slew of videos from the Roman Catholic side being like, hey, sure, even if we grant a bunch of this evidence, it's okay because development. And we saw Eastern Orthodox apologists say the exact opposite and just brute force assert, no, it can't be a development because clearly the council says it can't be. But there's something bizarre about saying there is no development, but then having situations like this where you should be, where sometimes they do retroactively retcon someone's saint status or retcon someone being a trusted teacher, and situations where they look back and say, actually, this thing that all these other people that we respect and have sainted believe, yeah, actually, if you affirm that today, you can't be part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? It almost feels like I'm going to have your cake and eat it too, right? There is no development, but also when we have clear development, it's okay, as long as we don't call it development. And so, what are some examples of that, and how do you process that?
So, I mean, clearly for me, the processing ended with not becoming Eastern Orthodox. That was a big thing. It's taking those in stride and accepting those as pieces of evidence, even if you have a predisposition for it. For me, one of the easy examples has been like, I guess this is a different example. It would be Nestorius. It's not necessarily something that changed. But it would be stuff like icon veneration, right? To now we have the tradition that is supposedly passed down that Luke was the first icon maker. Find me someone in the early church who wrote that down, please. I haven't found it. I've read through a lot of writings from a lot of periods. I've read through a lot of history books. I just can't seem to find it, even in early church history books. Eusebius doesn't talk about it. Theodoret doesn't talk about it. I can't find anyone. Unless one of them wrote about it in a place I just haven't read yet, which is possible. I'm not going to say it's not possible. But when you look at like the positive impact of figures like Origen, right? We have textual criticism in the positive sense, not the overly critical sense that has appeared in modern history research. We have the hexapla, right? If we could have our hands on the hexapla now, I mean, that would be a field day for scholars. If anyone doesn't know what that was, Origen took 6 different translations and set them side by side, column by column, in just one big book. All we have now is fragments, unfortunately. But man, treasure troves. There are so many practices we still do to this day from figures like Origen. There was a reason he was preaching in the pulpit at, I think 19, and he wasn't even clergy yet. He was laity, and they were like, yeah, you get up here and you teach. You know what you're doing. I'm just like, how does someone like that get moved so far down? Yeah, he taught some bad things. He was a little too speculative for his own good. And with how much of he wrote, we still have those things and we can see it, but we also get to see the development in his own theology and him trying to come to terms and grapple with these things. And I don't know how you can settle with condemning someone who is just trying to figure it out and the people around him who were also priests and bishops and teachers of the faith, not condemning him for it. He had 1 bishop out of 3 who tried to remove him from his offices. And I'm just like, why do we have to sit here and say that this man's a heretic? Why do we have to sit here and condemn Didymus the blind? Why do we have to sit here and start retroactively trying to apply these things when they just don't fit the historical record? It's okay to just say things have changed. Is it that hard? It just seems easier to do that than try and do all these mental gymnastics, which is what I was trying to figure out. How could they agree with this? And the amount of mental hoops I had to jump through was just too much. I was like, I can't jump through all these hoops to affirm this. It makes no sense.
Yeah. Well, and how do you factor in, right? Especially seeing the history, seeing figures like Origen, right? Who, and there's good arguments going both ways. So, like
Yeah.
you said, right? Origen said some heretical things, some wacky
Yep.
things in the midst of all this stuff, these tomes upon tomes that he wrote down. There are times where, for example, there seems to be, from my understanding, I haven't done a lot of research myself into it, but from my own understanding, like you mentioned, even with someone like Nestorius, where Nestorianism is heresy, is horrendous, and it's really bad. But Nestorius is an individual. There seems to be scholarship today. It's implying like, well, maybe Nestorius himself wasn't even an historian, right? And it may be
Yep.
that people misunderstood him and ran away with his teachings and developed them to the degree that they came up with Nestorianism. Maybe he wasn't even a proponent of
Yeah.
Nestorianism. And I don't know how accurate that is. I always hear about that as an example. But with these and other things in mind, and having read some ancient histories, having read a lot of the church fathers, what are your thoughts on this idea that the church cannot ever err, or not err as in like you can't have individual members that err,
Yep.
but the church as a whole can never make any significant mistake? How do you process that?
Fun. I am on the train of Nestorius wasn't a Nestorian as people teach it. Samuel Monette, I think, does a good job of covering his teachings in his history book. Is it Christianity in Asia? I think. I'm not going to go too far down there rabbit hole since I know it's contested. But if you read the Bazaar of Heraclides, Nestorius is like, yeah, I agree with Chalcedon. What are you guys talking about? He writes it while he's in exile. He doesn't live to see the end of the council, unfortunately. Otherwise, maybe history would be different with Nestorius. But for me, one of the big things was the Arian controversy, which I first learned about, I think is a podcast that's still on Spotify as far as I'm aware, the History of the Early Church podcast. They haven't made anything in a while. And of course, I would recommend going to the primary sources they list, and they list plenty. But going through that, right, Athanasius, for anyone who studied church history very deeply, you know who Athanasius is. He wrote On the Incarnation, still the go-to book on the Incarnation to this day, 1700 years later. The church became mostly Arian, which is the teaching that Christ was a created being, that he was not sort of a co-eternal divinity. He was divinity and he was eternal, but he was created. He wasn't co-eternal. He wasn't the eternal begotten. And to anyone who doesn't see why that's a big problem, the immediate implication of that is that Christ is not fully, truly divinity, as the scriptures teach he is. It's a big problem. And it was a huge controversy. Arius was first condemned for it. But then over time, the church became largely Arian for 50 years, if not maybe a little more, a little less, give or take. And we have figures like Athanasius and the Cappadocian Fathers and others who are fighting against it that entire time. And I'm just like, if your argument is on majority, the majority's failed already. Most of the church was Arian. It was the official teaching of the church for 50 years. If it can't have changed, then your only answer to that can be, it is not a majority. It is the true teaching of the church. Okay, how can I know that? Well, then most people will say by what the majority of the church says. And I'm just like, that doesn't work. We have what is now considered orthodoxy because people stood up to what the majority were saying. There was a massive minority of people that were standing up to these people. If you just go through, any number of Eusebius mentions the Arian controversy, but now there's tons of commentators on what happened after the fact. Athanasius gets exiled 5 times over the course of his lifetime, several of them because of the Arian controversy and because he won't step down. I'm just like, we have the church exiling a man for standing up what we now call the true teaching of the church and is the true teaching of the church. How can we say that the church can't err? And if we
there's a big presupposition there as well, and obviously we would agree, right, that Athanasius ultimately the Lord utilized him and the other faithful Christians of their day to win out the battle, right, against the Arians. But there's a presupposition that is made a lot of the time in these conversations where our Eastern Orthodox friends will say, oh yeah, well, but the Arians weren't actually representative of the church. They didn't actually, even if they were in the majority, even if they did hold an Arian council with more bishops represented, even then, they're not actually representative of the church. But then when a lot of Protestants say, well, wait a minute, why don't we use some of that same logic on Nicaea too? Then suddenly, no, that could never be the case.
Yeah.
Right? and there seems to be we need to presuppose who the church is, which I think in part gets a little bit into this issue of, yeah, I guess what comes first, chicken or the egg, right? When they're
Yeah.
saying, well, no, well, you have to have an infallible church, and but before you can get there, you have to figure out who is the church,
Yep.
and you have to privately interpret who is the church, right? If you're living in the day of Athanasius and you see the majority of the church saying, hey, actually, it's okay that Jesus isn't co-substantial with the Father, it's okay that he's just a created being, and they're trying to kick out Athanasius, how do you as a layperson interpret that? You have to figure out who is the true church and who isn't, based on what the scriptures teach. That is your responsibility, whether you're literate, whether you're illiterate. All right,
Yeah.
it's going to be your responsibility in Athanasius' day to figure out that Athanasius is actually correct, and that you need to support that side, whether or not he gets exiled. But a lot of the time, I feel like there's almost like a looking back on history, as though no one ever wonders, like, how did people alive at that point figure that out? Or no one
Yeah.
ever wonders, right? Whether we're looking at, I won't bog us down with this, but we look at even canon, and that's one of the same mistakes. It's like people sometimes, well, the situation is much more complicated than just a bunch of people got together and decided what the Bible is. Obviously,
Yeah.
that's not what happened. But even there, let's pretend that something like that was what happened, right? Even though it isn't. They never slow down to think, well, the father said that all the members of these councils need to, the idea needs to come from somewhere. And they need to argue it from somewhere. It's not like they're sitting there
Yeah.
and a light beam shines forth, and now they know the knowledge of the right stuff. No, there's reasons that they're giving. There are things that they're saying. There are people that they're debating with. There are people that they disagree with. These are people that are actually doing, people things at these councils, and they're trying to grasp at the truth. But we need to ask the question: how could they figure out what the truth is, and how could they figure out who to side with? In these issues? They need to decide, and we can get into the definition of private or not, but through private judgment, they need to figure out who is the church. Is it Athanasius?
Yep.
Is it Arius? Who is the church? And that's something that they need to figure out. And that's not something that we get to escape just by being anachronistic.
Yep. Yeah. And just going through the Bible, right? How do you figure who is on the right side? Well, the prophets told them, listen to us telling you the voice of God, go read the scriptures and the things that have been taught this from the scriptures that you can understand. We know you can understand it because you're not liking what we're calling you up for. You know you're doing wrong. When Jesus confronted the Pharisees, have you not read? He presumed that they could read the scriptures and figure it out and figure out the right answer. The Corinthians with Paul, the Galatians with Paul. I'm just like, there's all these places. It's just like they expect them to be able to figure it out. The answer's there, and they're still just choosing to do wrong. It's whether out of ignorance, spiritual blindness, or intentional maliciousness.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and so then that's what we would say, right? Because these are people that the church is made up of, there can be errors that creep in.
Yep.
Right. Not always, even classically speaking, as Protestants, we would all agree that the church can't die. Right. That's why no Protestant group was on the side of like the Anabaptists. That's why the Anabaptists were not well liked. Right. Because when you walk around saying things like the church died, well, no one's going to be on your side that has any sense about them. So we do obviously affirm the indefectibility of the church in toto. But that doesn't mean that quotients of the church can't err. It doesn't mean that councils can't err. It doesn't mean any of that.
Yep.
And so, well, with that then, moving a little bit forward then, when it comes to developments, right? So what are some more of these issues then that you have with developments? What are some of these issues that you have then once we understand that, well, the church is made up of people and these people change their ideas? Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that and the role that plays in your evaluation of Eastern Orthodox claims?
Yeah. Let's sort of recap and then add on a little bit. Right. You got Origen, you got Didymus, you got Nestorius. I didn't bring up people who hold to Origen's teachings that are still champions of the faith. The Cappadocian Fathers. Which one is it? I know at least one of them. It's one of the Gregories. Is a universalist, just straight up. And people will argue that. You go to his writings, he's universalist. He says it. He's not hiding it. He agrees with Origen, at least to some extent. You get stuff like toll houses. And you want to talk about a hot button issue in Eastern Orthodoxy, it's toll houses. That's going to be one of those things that's really hard. the debate on the perpetual virginity, not whether or not it's there. That's been a pretty standard teaching of the Orthodox Church for a while, the various Orthodox churches. But when did it become dogmatic? You will find Eastern Orthodox who tell you that you must believe that in order to be within salvation. You will find some who don't say that. You get stuff like the Council of Jerusalem in 1679, 82, around there. That just adds even on more things. And that's stuff that like EO today still deny and some accept. Like they're not agreed on that, even though it should be an officially binding council. For a lot of them, it was a pan-Orthodox council. And I'm just like, all these things changing. If it wasn't for the requirement of conscience bindings to a lot of these things, I think I could be Eastern Orthodox. But if you want to be an Eastern Orthodox and be consistent and agree with the teachings of your church, you have to agree with these anathemas that developed over time. You have to agree with these councils that change things over time. You have to agree with stuff like the perpetual virginity, whether or not you actually agree with it, and some of the other Marian teachings. Even in Eastern Orthodoxy, it's not quite as bad as Roman Catholicism, but it's there. For me, if it's not only is it changes that break these truth statements, are these things I am expected to be believing that are binding on my conscience. That is the biggest factor for me. If you have to say yes, I agree to this, and then you can't in good conscience, and then you either have to lie, or just your entire life say I disagree with the official teaching of the church. I'm just like, I can't sign on board with that. I know some people can. I can't. That is a deal breaker for me.
And to be clear for people at home, that's not even like rugged individualism. It's you're saying that in light of everything else that we've said, right? In light of there are times where people just pretend that something was the consistent opinion of everybody at all times when it clearly wasn't. There are times where history is retroactively, it just retconned, frankly, and in some cases, in situations like you said, where the data is actually very convoluted, and it could go either way, and yet you must hold dogmatic positions on it, going one way. So it's not even about like, oh, this doesn't fit my personal fancy, because like we said, right, a lot of us and within the Protestant umbrella love confessionalism. A lot of us adhere to confessions. So it's not even about rugged individualism. It's just, like you said, what do you do when you're faced with these things in light of all the problems that are there? And so moving on then from that, I think you covered a little bit there, especially with the anathemas, right? What some of the things that you never found compelling, especially those anathemas, right? So I want to move on from that to asking you then, and we covered it a little bit, but I want to develop it a little bit more. Why do you think it is that we've seen a trend of Protestants online who find themselves enthralled by Rome, by the East, and then they convert like very quickly? I mean, you and I encounter this all the time, being in driving side by side server. I'm one of the admins now. You're one of the moderators over there, even though we both started as just people that were in the server, just hanging out. We run into people like that all the time. People come into the server and they're on the verge of converting. Sometimes people will come in and announce like, hey, I remember there was a guy one time that announced that he had maybe a couple months before he was set to fully convert, but he wanted to give it one final go, right? One final hurrah before he converted. We run into people that are, they don't want to convert, but they feel drawn to it almost inexplicably. There's all sorts of things that we see in the server, and Lord willing, we help a lot of people, at least we try. And there are other people that it's just like, when you start asking them questions, well, okay, so you're going to convert potentially like within the next couple of months. Have you read any church history book? No. Okay, well, how many of the fathers have you read? Have you read any of their works, cover to cover? I say as someone that struggles with not the book hop, but you're not even cover to cover, but have you read substantial portions of the fathers? No. Not outside of the quotes that are thrown at me in the apologetics that I watch. It's like, okay, have you read any of the report? No. But there seems to be this like hurried nature of like, but I need to figure it out now. I need to convert now. We need to get to sit here and do nothing. Someone do something. And so why do you think that is? Where do you think that comes from?
I think a majority of it is just panic and fear, which I mean, to just be honest, that is a lot of the apologetics against Protestants from people like Craig Trugala and, I can't remember the Roman Catholic guy's name right now. There's so many of them, but they just attack, and it's to instill fear and to encourage fear. That is the purpose. And I mean, I get for some of them, they might genuinely think it's only their church that has it. But I also know some who openly say that we're Christians, even without the fullness of the faith, and still use the fear tactic. And I think that's what gets people and draws them in so much is that they panic and they're like, oh, I'm going to die and I'm going to go to hell if I die right now. And I mean, of course, that's a scary thought. But if you let fear rule you, you're not converting, one, for the right reason, and two, right? C.S. Lewis, I think, put it really well in Mere Christianity. If you convert just to Christianity, and was his example, out of fear, and this was coming from, right, everyone knows about hellfire preaching. If someone converts out of fear, when the fear runs out, so do they. They go with it. The fear won't keep them there forever. And if you find yourself in one of these churches and you converted out of fear, and now you're no longer scared, and you look around and you're not convinced of the teachings, well, then now you're in an even worse boat because you're going to now leave everything you switched over to after. And I mean, you and I have both seen people who, like, they enter a cage stage and get aggressive and can burn bridges or cause actual harm to people and in relationships, emotionally, mentally, and drag people down. And then you have to deal with that afterwards.
And when you scratch past the surface in a lot of those cases, very unfortunately, even some of the people that are being the most aggressive, praise the Lord, we don't get a lot of that on the server, right?
Yeah.
I actually think the vast majority, like 99% of our interactions in the server, have been overwhelmingly positive. Even when people have converted, they end up following the rules and they see their way out, right? Because that's the spaces for individuals that need help, not individuals that have already converted. But we run into one or two cases where people enter into this cage stage and they start arguing with people in the server. And before we're like, hey, man, you need to honor your commitment and leave the server, or unfortunately, we're going to have to kick you out if you keep this up, because, you know, it's not a debate stage. What's wild is the one or two times that's happened that I've been there, you ask a couple extra questions, like you just like dig a little bit, scratch a little bit past the first layer, and it's just empty. It's like they didn't even understand fully what they were converting to.
Yeah.
They like, a lot of it is just based out of fear. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes when people are not convinced by something and they're afraid, they need to be aggressive, because if I can just convert other people to my side, then I'll finally convince myself that it's right. And if I can just attack enough people and they don't know what to do, and I can burn enough bridges, that, hey, and if it still works, and if I'm still convicted of this, then that means I must be right.
Yep.
But a lot of the time, there's no real research that undergirds that. There's no real, even spiritual foundation that undergirds that. The amount of times that I've seen these decisions be made by people who are not praying, by people who are not reading the scriptures, by people that, frankly, unfortunately, even when they're not praying, even when they're not reading the scriptures, they're not spending that time reading books either. It's just the truth, right? And so I think you're right. I think a lot of the times these decisions are made based on fear, and they're made in a rushed manner because of it, right? I mean, imagine if someone tells you, "Hey, you could die any moment, and if you die right now where you are, that's it, eternity in hell, away from God. Doesn't matter that you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. Doesn't matter that you tried to make your life align with the script. None of that matters. You must agree with me, or you're going to hell. The end."
Yep.
That has a way of making you become a little bit irrational, as we all do. Right? We all become irrational when it's our life on the line, and I think that's what we see a lot of.
Yeah. Humans are not perfectly logical beings. We are ruled by emotions more often than logic. I say that as a pretty logical person. When my emotions take over, I'm not controlling it anymore. They're going to run wild if someone's not there to help calm me down. And I mean, I just think, right, God's own words in the scriptures, perfect love cast out fear. You know, if you just slow down and focus on God, even if you still convert, that's fine. But that perfect love cast out fear needs to be something a lot of people keep in mind. I think it's vital.
Yeah. And so with that, I want to move on here to some of the questions that I always ask people, because I find them to be informative, and also B, it demonstrates what it looks like when you actually look at some good resources on the issue. Like I always say, like I've done all my other interviews, Once we are done with our interview here, Josh will send me a book list, a recommended reading on church history, church fathers, and maybe even Wesley or reformers, as many things, even modern day resources, as you think would be helpful to people. I'll put them into a list. They'll be down below, available for free on my locals. Quick plug. If you're someone that goes there and maybe you're like, wow, this book list is really helpful and there's other helpful things here, and I like this channel a lot, please consider subscribing to my locals and helping to support the channel. I would really appreciate that. And so with that plug over, who are some of your favorite church fathers? And are there any writings in particular that you really, really value from them? Or maybe some that helped you in dealing with Eastern Orthodoxy?
Gotcha. I'll also take this chance to plug, please like and subscribe to Javier's YouTube channel if you've made it this far. It's very important. That's it. That's the plug. For me, I mean, as I write the Arian controversy, if no one gathered it, was a big part of my research journey. Athanasius and the Cappadocian Fathers, right? The heroes of the Arian controversy. Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. I just love their writings. If you guys get a chance to read On the Holy Spirit, can't recommend it enough. On the Incarnation, a lot of ondas in the Church Fathers, beautiful works. I know Basil. I think is it on my desk still? I don't think it is. I think I've moved it to another bookshelf because I'm working through other stuff. They'll have stuff on on social justice. If there's a topic you can think of, one of those four guys probably touched on it at least a little bit, and I can't recommend their works enough. It's just a beautiful collection, and you'll also be able to tell where they kind of, especially Basil's brothers of one of the Gregories. I think it's Gregory of Nyssa, and then Gregory of Nazianzus was their friend. You can tell when they worked together, or maybe Basil was bullying them. Who knows? Hard to tell with them. But those are kind of my two favorite works from them: is On the Incarnation and On the Holy Spirit. Absolutely love them.
And so, normally I linger a little bit more on these, but just looking at the time, I'll try to run through a little fast. Who are a few of your favorite Reformation voices? I know you've focused mainly on the Church Fathers, as it were, and you've been reading a lot of Wesley. So hey, I'll let you, even though he's not a reformer, I'll let you cheat and say Wesley if you want.
I mean, I would say John Wesley is a reformer of Arminianism, not Arianism, Arminianism. Important. He was absolutely a reformer there. So I cheat. Yes, John Wesley. When it comes to a lot of reformers, I haven't read a lot. I'll just be honest. I read more of the proto-reformers, John Wycliffe and friends. I read a bit of Luther. If you can work through it, his introduction on Romans is great. His introduction on Galatians is great. I recommend an annotated version. The long one is good. However, it's very repetitive, and he goes on a lot of rants. It was a lot like working through Augustine's City of God. So to anyone who says I struggle to work through an entire work of the Church Fathers, let me tell you, it's doable. If you sit through Augustine's City of God and work through that in 3 weeks, you can handle it. I promise.
Luther with his rants, not just against the papers, but against the Anabaptists.
Oh yeah,
not like the Anabaptists.
Yeah, I mean, Luther was a character. He's a good writer and entertaining to read, just like Augustine. But man, those rants, they get crazy. I think those would be the big ones for me. If getting to cheat and add John Wesley above all else. But Luther's good. I've read a little bit of Calvin, also good. There's definitely a lot more agreement with Arminianism and Reformed teachings than a lot of people think. And reading through Calvin's Institutes, you can definitely see it.
And then, who are a few of your favorite modern day voices and the Protestant and ecclesialist debate that you benefited from the most? And then maybe also, who are some of your favorite modern day Eastern Orthodox voices? Because we talked a little bit about how some of the negativity online and the lack of substance sometimes can be grating. So if maybe you want to talk about who some of your favorite EO or Eastern Orthodox voices are, and then who some of your favorite Protestant voices are.
Gotcha. Gavin Ortland, he's great. Definitely helped me shore up a lot of things when I moved into SSBS. SSBA is great, helping refine me and help me kind of narrow down on a lot of things. And Gavin's videos have been really good for that. Father James, you just interviewed him. I think it's up on YouTube already with Barely Protestant. I watched it. I remember. Even though he doesn't make a ton of content, he makes good stuff. Sorry, Other Paul. But other Paul also said this year he's going to be pumping out some content for 2024. So,
Yep.
hey, if you do it, you'll be moving up.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. If your channel had been around when I was going through those questions, it absolutely would have been on the list. It's been fantastic going through all these interviews. Most of the stuff I watch other than that kind of stuff is not really apologetics. I kind of like more positive things, right? Figures like Anthony Rogers, he's good. He's an apologist, but not necessarily in this particular issue. He kind of moves into it every once in a while. Theosophical Wonderings as well, but he doesn't make a ton of stuff. If you guys know about Ancient Past TV, I don't know where they do their research and find stuff, but man, they make great long form videos. Most of what I would just recommend to people nowadays is avoid the polemics and find people who are just telling you what their theology is and presenting it in a more positive way. I've dropped most of the Eastern Orthodox apologists. I wouldn't rate most of them highly. They're really polemic. They're really driving in fear tactics. Some of the really the only one I can think of that's like a super positive I would recommend, and I'm sure there's others, is Father Stephen D. Young. I think he's super charitable, super gracious, and just entertaining to listen to. He doesn't do a ton on apologetics, but he does just kind of go through, he has this podcast that goes through verse by verse on the Bible. I found him to be an apologist I can really, really get behind, even though I'm not Eastern Orthodox. Stephen D. Young gets a big thumbs up. There was one I watched for a while, but he's taken all his stuff down. He stepped out of the game. He found that even for him as an Eastern Orthodox, the online community is just not good for him. So when priests are stepping out of the ring because of the online community, I think this is a lot. Roman Catholic apologists
have to have a thick skin to be
online. As much as I don't like Trent Horn on Protestantism, I don't think he does a good job talking about Protestantism. I do think he does a good job overall. I know you've talked about him. Eric Ybarra, highly recommend Eric Ybarra. Eric Ybarra is great. He's got to be one of my favorites. Those are kind of the other voices I would recommend.
Yeah. So that as we start drawing to a close here with my final couple of questions, something that I find important, right? Like we said, sometimes people, when they go into panic mode, we all do this. We all become to some degree irrational. We start to take mental shortcuts, go toward things that have the biggest threats, and siding with those just in case, right? I know, even being honest with everyone at home, I think I mentioned this before. There are times where if I'm not praying, and if I'm not, if I'm skipping out on my devotionals, if I'm getting too caught up with work, there are times where sometimes those doubts can start creeping back. Oh, what if you're wrong, right? Like what if? And it's funny because I mentioned this in the past, I think, but when that happens, I kind of, I'm like, okay, great, I gotta get back into the core spiritual disciplines again. But B, for me also, it's like grinding myself. Wait a minute, I don't find any of this stuff compelling. Why is this little, hey, like type thought like sneaking its way back in? It just threats. And it is what it is. But all that being said, right, when we get past the threats that are being made, when we actually slow down, one of the things that we also always tell people over at the Discord server at SSBS is, hey, are you plugged into a local church, right? Do you have community? Do you have a pastor? Yeah, I know maybe right now you're doubting whether or not the sacraments are valid. Do you have a pastor? Do you have a pastor you can these questions? How are things going? And so that being said, I want to ask you, right? How is your church life? Are you plugged into a local church? You kind of mentioned you are earlier.
Yeah.
Are you being discipled by anyone? Are you discipling anyone? How are things going for you?
Man, I love my church. They're great. I don't agree with them on everything on the show, but I love it overall. I'm also not only at Asbury Church, I'm also at Asbury Theological Seminary. They're not officially affiliated in the past, but they're kind of down here. They're kind of working together now. And I'm sort of working towards prison chaplaincy, so I've definitely found quite a few voices to be listening to, because that is not an area I have any experience or expertise in, so I need a lot of help. I am a lay teacher at the church down here. I don't teach every Sunday, but I do get to teach fairly often, and I love getting to teach. I love getting to hear from the community. Quite a few of them are happy to give me feedback. Some of them are nervous, and I'm just like, no, come up and tell me what I did wrong, please. I need the community as much as the community needs people to teach them, because they'll always have other teachers. I won't always have the chance to learn. my entire church, and I know not everyone agrees with me, but this is how we should view the church, is like one big family for me. And especially in our smaller, more closely connected community group, I'm like, yeah, oh, you guys need money? You need me to jump in front of a bullet? You know, it's happening. I'm not even going to think about it. And I've truly been blessed being able to study and worship at the same place every work. I have found myself in a bit of a spiritual mentor role. I did not 2 years ago. I would have said I'd never be a teacher, and I'm teaching on Sundays, and I'm looking at being a prison minister now. So things have changed in the past few years. You never know where God's going to take you. But I love being discipled. I have quite a few mentors. I absolutely submit to those above me, you know, and as I'm working through John Wesley and Jacob Arminius, because they have a lot of writings, it's just like submitting to the people who came before me has been one of the best things I've ever done. And you want something to help keep you humble is find someone to be under and listen to and trust as a mentor and accept correction from. There have been times where I've just been wrong on something and I've been corrected, and I can't tell you how much of a blessing that truly is. I joke sometimes that being a moderator at SSBS too feels like another job. But it has truly been a blessing, both to help people who struggle with anxiety to the point where, you know, sometimes they've broken down in showers, or right. If anyone's had a panic attack, it's like that. And my heart goes out to everyone who has to go through that. But it's also been great there. Is just like talking with people has really forced me to figure out, how can I talk to people? How can I help them? What's actually going to be something that will help them and not hurt them, right? Because I've talked to people and made it worse. And man, that gets you. And that's something everyone needs to be ready to kind of grapple with as you continue to walk in Christ. As any good Methodist, I am in quite a few of what we call the methods. Other Paul, I'm going to tell you only 2 of the methods. You're not going to get the rest. Those are still a mystery for you, but I'm sorry.
What are the methods?
What are the methods? But if anyone's heard of class meetings and band meetings, it's sort of like a discipleship group is what a class meeting is. You get together and you talk about what God's doing in your lives. And that's really it. That's the big focus, at least in the modern day. And then band meetings is like an accountability confessional group, which is, yes, very open, very revealing. You need to be ready to confess anything and everything. But having someone who will hold you accountable and then help you through those things, it makes a huge difference in your life.
Yeah. No, and again, and that's why I always want to emphasize this for people, right? And sometimes we hear this and we roll our eyes, we joke around online, but it's like, oh, all the memes and stuff about touching grass. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Seriously though, especially, I think a lot of this anxiety, interestingly enough, I would say it didn't start here, but for a lot of us, that's when we encountered it. The pandemic, being stuck inside, being away from your family, being away from people. And that's where a lot of us started looking into this stuff. Yeah. When you're not going outside, whether we mean it literally, like you're just stuck inside all the time, or metaphorically, when you're just stuck behind the screen and you're dealing with nothing but polemics, you weren't even equipped to understand the polemics when it first started out. When you're disconnected from community, you're disconnected, that's always a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Right? And the scriptures say that the devil prowls around like a lion, looking upon whom he may devour. And I don't know how much, I may not be a animal expert or what have you, but I do know that when a lion sees a hyena that's alone and hurt, right, he'll rather take that on than take on an entire pack of them.
Yep.
Right? And so the devil's the same. And when we're isolated from people, when we're not being discipled, when we're not being tethered to reality in the life of the local church, it can be really easy to come up with all these highfalutin ideas and problems. And again, these things matter, right? I mean, that's why a lot of the reason why I have interviews and stuff on this channel, right? The issues matter, but they need to be contextualized. They need to be contextualized within the community. And so with that, then, as I go to my final 2 questions for you here, one is this, right? So we talked a lot about Eastern Orthodoxy at the beginning, what you found alluring, some of the issues you found when you ultimately didn't go over there, how your community is, and how much you love your church. Yep. What about being a Methodist? Do you find to be uniquely special in comparison, not just to the East, but also to other Protestant traditions? Like, why did you ultimately choose the Methodist Church instead of another tradition within the Protestant umbrella?
Yeah. Honestly, a lot of the same things that kind of drew me into Eastern Orthodoxy, that acceptance of mystery and pursuing the mystery of God, the focus on holiness, um, and of course is a sad tendency in Methodist history to sometimes become sort of works righteous. That was one thing Wesley sort of always fought against, but is the focus on actually living out the gospel and being true disciples. That is a huge draw for me. The methods, right, is part of the huge focus on community. From the very beginning of Methodism, it was always focused on community and being together and living out life together, watching over one another in love. I think is how John Wesley would put it in pretty much every circumstance he could. Right? And that's such a huge focus. I can't emphasize that enough for everybody, is find your community and get plugged in. And I'm really hoping with the UMC has been a big shakeup for Methodism. Now, I'm sure plenty of people heard about the split. I'm hoping that's one of the things that helps with the Reformation movement within Methodism, because there's a lot of good things in Methodism, but man, we let a lot of really bad things get in here too, and we really got to work that out and get that figured out. And of course, right, going through John Wesley, going through Arminius, and as I said when I encountered it for the first time, I am definitely mostly in line with Arminian theology, confessionally and historically. The teachings on everything from total depravity to when you hit the end of predestination in the Scripture, leave it a mystery at the end. Don't try to keep going. If I wasn't a Methodist, I'd probably be Anglican or Lutheran. Some people might be surprised by the Lutheran part, but let them be confused. The Anglican part probably makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's a mystery. And the reason I kind of ultimately went with Methodism, it was that theological kind of fit in this, if you will. I think it's just where I've kind of found my home.
Yep. And I appreciate that. I'm always curious about how people end up where they do, and the emphases that bring them in that direction. So with that, then, Josh, as we wrap up our interview, I have one final question for you, the one that I always ask people in interviews like this, and it's cheating because it's a two-parter question. But what is a final word you would like to give to, number one, any Eastern Orthodox people that may be listening, and maybe they're considering, maybe they're struggling with some of the same issues, maybe they've also seen some of the same cracks in the armor that you noticed, and they're thinking about joining a tradition within the Protestant umbrella. Maybe they want to be Lutheran or Anglican or Methodist. Maybe they're thinking about it. What would you say to them? And then what would you say to any Protestants who may be listening? Maybe there's Methodists listening, Presbyterians, Baptists, whatever it may be, and they're struggling with ecclesial anxiety, right? And they listen to what you said, to what we're saying. They're like, well, you know what? Maybe I am being taken over by fear. Maybe it is clouding my judgment, but I don't know what to do. And they feel tempted to make the jump over to the East. And so, what would you say to both of those groups?
Gotcha. For anyone who watches my videos, if it looks like I read a script, it's because I do, and you're about to see that pretty clearly right now. I'm a guy who needs a script. I'm sure everyone can tell I've been pretty rambly. My advice to both is to just pray and take your time. Do not rush it. If you are somewhere that God is acting and the gospel is being preached, if you recognize that God is the author and the one who carries out your salvation, it's not your own work, then amen. You may very well already be in your home. God guides us into truth. Trust that he is guiding you. Don't let the words of some online apologist cause you to have nothing but anxiety and worry and distract you. No matter where you are now, God has work for you to do and wants to guide you into a path of life and joy in his blessings and his promises. If you let anxiety and worry overtake you, then you won't be doing the work he has for you. You won't be pursuing the path he has in front of you, and you will not be living into the fullness of life that God has promised you. And more importantly, make sure that Christ is the foundation of your faith. You may have seen or heard of people say, if the magisterium isn't true, then I won't be Christian. Or if you've seen people become unconvinced of like KJV onlyism and leave the faith, then that's clearly a sign that their faith wasn't founded on Christ. The rock of faith for them was the wrong thing. If you right now would genuinely leave the faith, if your view changed on which tradition you are in right now, then you need to seriously look and reevaluate your faith. That's my advice and my challenge. Make sure that you're praying. Make sure that you're still in your church. Make sure you're still doing what God's calling you to do, and make sure that he is the foundation of your faith.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Josh, like you said, I appreciate you a lot. You're one of my first friends I made over at SSBS. And so this is a special interview. It's a really cool interview. I loved having you on. I love that when like I do with all my guests, when I send you the questions, you took the time to not just read through them, but figure out some notes on what you wanted to
Yep.
say for each. I really appreciate you just taking the time and coming on. And so, again, for everyone at home, if you want to find out more as far as Josh, if you want to see more of his content, if you would like what you saw today, you want to see more, please go check him out at Practical Christian Lessons, PCL. That is a brand new YouTube channel, and so make sure to check him out. Is there anything else that you want to say, Josh, before we head out?
If you go to my blog, don't expect a ton of Wesleyan Arminian stuff except for the YouTube scripts. Just a heads up there. That's not the focus of my blog. That's the focus of my YouTube. I think I've said everything I want to say, right? Make sure you're in your church and you're being a disciple and you're living out the faith. Don't let fear stop you from praying, from being with God, from being with your family.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Josh. As always, it's a pleasure talking with you. It's a pleasure having you on. Maybe we can have you on and do more content together as time goes on. And so I really appreciate that. So, all right, Josh, well, thank you, and we'll see you later.
God bless.